Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast, and welcome to today's guest. This is Jamie Shaw. Jamie is a PhD from the University of Western Ontario, postdoctoral fellow at Leibniz University, and the editor of a recent book, Interpreting Feyerabend. Jamie, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
No, my pleasure. And of course, that book I just mentioned, we are going to be speaking about Feyerabend. And most of your work, at least your recent work, has been on Feyerabend. So I might start with a little background on yourself. Tell me where you come to from this, and why Paul Feyerabend. Why did he attract you as he has?
Yeah, the first philosophy of science course I took was in my fourth year of undergrad, and I absolutely loved it and found my passion there. And that course was more of a science and technologies course, so it was very applied. I asked the teacher, can we do maybe something about the kind of philosophical background? So we did a course on Popper, Kuhn, Feyerabend, Lakatos, those kinds of the usual suspects. And that course was absolutely incredible to me. And I think there was a few things that stood out about all of those figures. I was really impressed by their kind of openness. I was always something of a fallibilist and always something of a skeptic, but not wanting to be a skeptic kind of thing. So people like Popper really spoke to me. I was like, they were actually talking about the things that I really cared about and was thinking about. And by the time we got around to Feyerabend, I was mesmerized. Feyerabend, of course, is a very entertaining writer, and I find him to be really funny. And he was struggling with some of the same things, or at least I perceived him to be struggling with some of the same dilemmas that I was struggling with at that age, right? So, I think most philosophy majors go through this phase at some point, but for me, I was figuring out how can you overcome skepticism without becoming a relativist or something like that. And that's something I never really found anybody being able to do in a successful way. And I'm not quite sure that Feyerabend was able to find that line either, but he certainly seemed to be taking it much more seriously than others that I had read before. And his sense of humor really stood out to me. I went to Queen's, which is it was wonderful, wonderful school, but also filled with a lot of people who came from money. I did not, and always felt a little bit out of place. And Feyerabend just stood out to me as somebody who is kind of cut from my side of the tracks. Somebody who had the same kind of sense of humor that I did, and had the same sort of attitude towards doing philosophy, that it didn't have to be all this hot, dry, terse, analytic kind of stuff. So those were kinds of the things that attracted me to him in the first place. I moved on to other things for a little bit, and then came back to it for a dissertation topic. I thought, why not really dig into the philosopher who really attracted me to the subject?
He also has an incredibly complicated legacy of his own here. You start a lot of your articles as you must, talking about how hard it is to pin Feyerabend down. There's these quotes that everyone probably has heard if they're aware of Feyerabend, things like he's the worst enemy of science. So how tricky is it to get a foothold into the work of Paul Feyerabend?
It's incredibly complicated and very difficult. Feyerabend was lazy by his own admission. And most of the writing that he did because he kind of had to. And so he talks quite frankly about this in his correspondence. He's not especially keen on trying to make himself clear if he's been misunderstood, or going over edit after edit after edit, like most philosophers kind of painstakingly do. He just kind of wasn't cut out for that sort of stuff. Like, that part of academia, I think, was a little bit boring to him. And that personality quirk while something I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, has the consequence that his papers read more like lectures. They have tangents. They have themes that come up that he never comes back to. He'll drop little nuggets here and there and then never follow up on it. He's not particularly careful. He can be in certain cases, but he's not always particularly careful with his word choice. And that can make it really, really hard to understand what he's trying to get at. Luckily, though, Feyerabend was somebody who wrote just so much that you can pick up on themes that reoccur over and over again in his corpus. So I still think that there's things to be said in terms of, what did Feyerabend believe in, or like what kinds of things was he thinking about, or what problems was he trying to solve. I think there's still things you can do with that, but you probably would have to do it in a little bit of a different way than you would with most traditional analytic philosophers. So I don't think he's the kind of person you can pin down in a quote, although he has lots of fun quotes. He's more somebody you have to read large amounts of him if you want to understand what he's really getting onto.
What is his reputation like? Because people always, after this, I'll jump into the meat of his philosophy. But he has this really strained reputation where he seems to be hated, he seems to be ignored in some senses, and yet outside of the academy, he is, people see him. I think the phrase you use somewhere in your work was, he was a hugely liberating force for young scientists. And even outside of the whole academic structure, he seems to have a much larger following than inside academia.
Yeah, and I think that's something that was very intentional, very by design. In Feyerabend's later work, he says, "I'm not a philosopher," by which he means I'm not like an academic intellectual. He cared about helping people and, publishing pieces that maybe only a handful of other intellectuals read is not necessarily the best way to do that, or at least he didn't think it was. So writing in a style and in a way that reaches out to a mass audience, I think is exactly what he was trying to get at. So I think he would be happy with that part of his legacy. Within philosophy, he's a very contentious figure. I certainly, when I first started deciding I was going to work on Feyerabend, and I would say this at conferences several times, I had people chase me around trying to convince me, like, no, you shouldn't work on Feyerabend, he's just crazy. Sometimes this was people who were a little bit older who knew him, and he wasn't particularly nice to them. So some people, they had personal investment in trying to stop, the spread of Feyerabend or something like that. But I think most of what I've encountered is, I think a lot of people are sympathetic to the kind of big picture things he was trying to do, right? So the rejection of scientific method, the idea that there are no solid foundations on which knowledge rests. A lot of these themes, which he, of course, worked with and came to very different conclusions than other people who also explored these themes, like Popper. A lot of people are very sympathetic to that, and his calls for pluralism and diversity, his calls for seeing science as something that is a set of institutions that needs to be, in some sense, accountable in a democratic kind of way. I think these kinds of things that he was arguing for have a lot of purchase in contemporary philosophy of science. So I think a lot of people are already sympathetic to what he's trying to do. But I find very, very few people who are willing to go to the conclusions that he came to, even though motivated by kind of similar considerations. There's also a lot of people, I think, who are polite and will kind of, tolerate some Feyerabend and hearing a bit about it, but they're skeptical. So you kind of have to prove to them that Feyerabend is a figure worth taking seriously. So there's a diversity of different takes on it, but I think that, Feyerabend still has a live legacy within philosophy of science. We're still trying to figure out what that legacy is. And I think he's somebody whose corpus is the kind of set of writings that I think a lot of people could really dig into and find valuable things in. So I'm not too cynical about a future kind of uptake of Feyerabendian themes, although I'd be quite surprised if there were many people who came to the same conclusions he did.
Well, when people do criticize Feyerabend, and I searched around for a bit of it, and I found mostly Joseph Agassiz, right, and against him.
Right.
His friend, of course, but critical terms. But whenever people do write harsh criticisms of Feyerabend, it always has to do with that phrase, anything goes. And you wrote of this phrase that it's perhaps the most notorious phrase in the 20th century philosophy of science. So I might get you to take us there. I know there's a lot to unpack here, but what is the traditional reading of this? So how are we meant to understand Feyerabend when he says, when it comes to science, anything goes?
Well, I think that historically, most of the readings of anything goes are nowhere close to what he meant. So one of them is something like, you can just believe in whatever you want to believe in. You can believe in demon possession. You can believe in general relativity. You can believe in, that cancer is caused by spirits in trees, or you can believe in more of a genetic explanation, right? So anything goes just means there's kind of license to say and believe anything that you want. And that's certainly not what Feyerabend was saying. And I think he was quite clear about that. Another kind of common interpretation of anything goes is that there's no such thing as methodology. Right? There's no such thing as thinking about steps that you might take to reach a conclusion about a specific subject matter. Right? So a common reading of Feyerabend is he gives these arguments against the idea of a universal fixed scientific method. And then after he abandons that, he thinks that there's nothing that can replace it. And so science is nothing more than this kind of intellectual free-for-all. And that I think has a tiny bit of truth to it, but again, is not quite what he meant. So I think that Feyerabend himself was not entirely clear on that phrase. But the way that I read Feyerabend and the way that I think is in keeping with a lot of what he was trying to say is that there are no necessary rules of scientific reasoning that you must perform as a result of some theory of rationality. So, it was common in Feyerabend's day, and I think still, although in very different guise, to say something like, there's a series of inferences and rules by which those inferences are governed, and that's capturing what scientific reasoning is, even if you're a pluralist and think that, okay, well, there's maybe 6 different ways to do that, you still think that there's something that it is to be rational, and we should all be rational. And to be rational is to follow these rules, and to follow these rules come what may. And I think what Feyerabend is arguing is that anything goes means that you are never constrained to follow a set of rules necessarily, right? So the original, or the German title of Against Method, I think is much more telling, where he says, it's actually wieder die Methodenschwang. The Schwang suffix on Methoden, on method, suggests that a better translation would be something like against the forced constraint of method. So of course you can be, and many scientists have been, methodical in the ways that philosophers kind of like to talk about. They They started with very, very careful observations, and then they drew similarity relations between them and then tried to generalize, or they put out bold ideas and tried to find out how that they were wrong. I mean, there are certainly cases that you can find where scientists do that, and Feyerabend sees no problem with that. That's something you're permitted to do. But science also, Feyerabend thinks, advances from breaking those rules willfully or not. And of course, when you start breaking away from tried and true kind of methods, you don't always know that you're going to succeed, right? So anything goes doesn't mean that no matter what you do, you're going to, come out with a really great scientific theory, or that you're going to make a great discovery. It that might be the case, but you might go nowhere. So anything goes is that once you have no rules that guarantee that you're going to be successful, and you can look historically at people who broke those rules, people like Galileo on Feyerabend's reading, and made great advances in science as a result of it, you're permitted to do the same. You're permitted to break the rules whenever you want. And by breaking the rules, it doesn't mean that you're entitled to believe anything you want. It certainly doesn't mean that you are free from criticism of views. But what anything goes means is that there's no kind of handcuffs, methodological handcuffs, that scientists must kind of wear that might be provided by the philosopher. So that's how I think anything goes ought to be understood, roughly speaking.
Now, you mentioned Galileo there, and a significant part of Feyerabend's philosophy is this historical turn, and this focus on how science has been done in history. And I'm assuming that there is a positive element to this, where he's not just saying that great scientists did break the rules in the past, but that it is also desirable in some way that we do seek to break the rules.
Yeah, so this is a great ambiguity in Feyerabend's own writing that I don't think he was particularly good at resolving. So one of the ways Feyerabend reconstructs his own argument in Against Method is to say, I never said that Galileo should have broken the rules. I'm just saying that for all of those who marvel at Galileo's achievements, you have to accept that breaking the rules is a good thing. This is a part of, I think, what has recently been called the dark ages of Feyerabend's thought, where he starts leaning more towards relativism, and he starts saying, like, yeah, I'm not coming down. I'm not saying whether it was a good thing or a bad thing that Galileo did what he did. I'm just saying that he did it, and in breaking the rules, this had certain consequences, and yeah, all the lovers of Galileo should also be kind of anarchists. But I think that that's a serious backtrack from what's actually in Against Method. So I think what's in Against Method is exactly what you're suggesting. He thinks that it was a good thing that Galileo broke the rules, right? Science profited from it. And I do think he's much more normative, and he does have a positive program that he's trying to build in Against Method. Although when he starts reconstructing his own philosophy years later, he seems to have changed his mind. But I think you're absolutely right. It was a good thing that Galileo broke the rules on Feyerabend's view.
How much of the pluralism of Feyerabend is a simple matter, but a matter of increasing the testability of a theory? Because at times he talks about that, it's okay to deal with myths and political ideas and religious systems, and invent things like this, as long as they create a kind of, I guess you'll call it an incommensurability theory, and therefore increase the testability, I think, of the theory at hand.
Yeah, so I think that the first edition of Against Method, Feyerabend is kind of at an in-between phase in his thought, and I don't think he recognizes that there's a tension here. Early Feyerabend is very explicit. Pluralism is to maximize the testability of scientific theories. That's its function. And Against Method, in one sense, is a continuance of this argument, and to open the doors to even more pluralism than he kind of allowed for before, right? So methodological pluralism is actually still in service of this Popperian tenet of trying to criticize our theories as ruthlessly as possible. But there's another line in Feyerabend's thought, which I think doesn't become much clearer until the 1980s, but you can find passages in Against Method where he kind of anticipates this idea. And I think this comes from when Feyerabend started looking much more closely at anthropological research on myths. And one thing we've also seen when we look at early drafts of Against Method, which so far haven't been published, one thing we see here is what some people have called the existentialist criticism of scientific method, which Feyerabend takes from Kierkegaard. So the idea is something like, the most important question isn't about the testability of scientific theories, it's about what kind of lives do we want to live. That's the fundamental, most important question, and everything needs to be in servitude of trying to give answers to that question. And I think what he found when he started going more and more into the anthropological literature is he found that followers of myths, it wasn't exactly obvious that their lives would be benefited by being more critical towards their beliefs. And the way I teach this is to think of, the example of, somebody who is just lives a very simple kind of life. They don't go out, they stare at the stars and they come up with all kinds of speculative theories about what's going on out there. And those theories give meaning to them, and it might bring them joy, and it might allow them to tell great stories, or maybe create great art or something like that, right? Like these theories that they just kind of came up with from looking at the stars might make their life really rich and empowering. Why would that person necessarily want to then go and learn a bunch of astronomy to figure out whether their views are actually right? I mean, in order to do that, they would have to change their whole life around. To go to school and read pile of books and becomes familiar with various jargons and blah, blah, blah. And all I think Feyerabend is trying to say is that it's not obvious that the goal of criticizing or testing in the most rigorous way possible our theories is an ultimate value that should guide the way we want to live our lives. It's one value. It can be an important one, but it might be one that we sacrifice because other things are more important to us. Community solidarity, just everyday joys, artistic sensibilities. There's a lot of things that might be important guides for life that push you in different directions than trying to criticize things. So I think that's an idea that Feyerabend picks up much more in the 1980s, but it's in Against Method in certain passages as well. And that is the much more radical view that the pluralism that you get isn't about serving testability anymore. That's one kind of pluralism. But pluralism also extends to forms of life where you're not particularly all that interested in that kind of Popperian criticism, that kind of lifestyle.
And I'm assuming one of the great, so I was going to ask you, and I suppose I should get this out of the way, how Popperian do you think Feyerabend was? And I'm going to couch the question. I did speak to Matthew O'Colladell on the podcast way back in episode number 2. So I'll leave that there. But my reading of this, again, it seems to be largely, significantly a historical issue that Feyerabend thinks that if scientists simply adopted the falsification principle, then some of the great discoveries or the great movements in science simply wouldn't have happened. And he's equating falsification with just another kind of rationalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, whether Feyerabend was a Popperian, I mean, this is such a big and difficult question.
Because they were very close at one point, and then they had a falling out like everyone tends to do with Popper. But there was one influence there. There was some early influence, and then at the end, it's very tricky, at least in my reading, to figure it out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about certain biographical facts. Feyerabend met Popper very early on during his PhD. He was very impressed by Popper's talk. He taught Popper's books in his courses, and his early papers are scattered with remarks talking about how whatever he's arguing is very much in service of the Popperian kind of view of scientific method. And I think that, yeah, it's very difficult to find out to what extent Feyerabend was a Popperian. When did he give up his Popperianism? These are all really difficult questions. My hunch, but I don't think, I'm still unsure about whether this is right, but my hunch is that Feyerabend was actually much more deeply influenced by thinkers other than Popper. But I'm not sure about this. So, if you look at the things that Popper really cares about, right, like problems of induction, can you have something like an inductive principle? Is that logically coherent? Feyerabend has two very short papers on this topic, and he doesn't really refer to them too much or build off of that work. Now, he was an anti-inductivist, so he comes to the same conclusion as Popper, but he doesn't really seem to concern himself that much with this thing that Popper really cared about. The very obvious breaking point intellectually between Popper and Feyerabend is when Feyerabend starts praising Niels Bohr. And he argues that kind of Bohr's quasi-positivism was not a kind of dogmatic principle. It was, the result of scientific research, right? So the idea that scientific method is something that waxes and wanes as scientific research changes. And that method isn't something that stands outside of science, like Popper's view that it's a convention that we ought to adopt for the rules of the game that we're playing. Feyerabend in those papers is very, very clear that Bohr was right, Popper was wrong. Scientific method is a part of practice, and it gets its content and its substance from scientific research. It's not something that philosophers can kind of promote from on high. But I think that idea, you can find elements of that as early as the late 1950s or early 1960s. So it's not totally clear that, that public break was just this sharp moment. I mean, it seemed like there's elements of Feyerabend that always kind of disagreed on that point. And I think if you kind of go down the list of the similarities that Feyerabend and Popper have intellectually, while there's certainly many common themes, it's not clear that Feyerabend was coming to Popperian conclusions on the basis of Popperian reasoning.
Do you think perhaps it's that they have some of the same enemies out there? I mean, in terms of ideas, they seem to both rail against justificationism and foundationalism and all these kind of old tropes within philosophy of science.
I think that's absolutely right. There's a very coarse-grained sense in which Popper and Feyerabend are at least the early Feyerabend are definitely kind of going against the same sorts of targets. I think that's absolutely right. I think the way I would summarize the view that I've kind of toyed around with in my head is that Feyerabend looks less like a Popperian at any stage of his career when you start really looking into the details. But the more you kind of zoom out, the more and more he looks like a Popperian. I think that's the way I would put it.
How much is he Lacatosian, if that is a phrase? Of course, his famous book Against Method was meant to be 2 parts with Lacatose, who was going to write 4 Method until he sadly died. And of course, I think it was within that book, reading it recently, he called Lacatose a law and order philosopher, I think was the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
So he clearly had lots of criticisms of him. But I caught this in some of your writings as well, but he seems to have some significant influence from Lacatose as well, particularly in terms of the research programs.
Yeah, so I think Feyerabend, more than just being close friends with Lacatose and really kind of respecting Lacatose's style of philosophy, I think more than that, the thing that Feyerabend was very impressed by, although disagreed with, is Lacatose's attempt to make theories of scientific rationality, which beforehand were mostly thought of a purely philosophical kind of task. Lacatose tried to make it historical. So he tried to make theories of rationality out of rational reconstructions of history. And I think, although Feyerabend is very critical and disagrees with that idea, I think Feyerabend and Lacatose were on the same tracks at the same time. And there must be some influence going on there. I mean, their correspondence is extensive. They were very, very good friends, talking to each other quite frequently, giving feedback on each other's stuff all the time. It's hard to believe that Feyerabend's turn towards history did not owe something to Lacatose. And I think that's kind of maybe the biggest influence that Lacatose had on Feyerabend.
Did Feyerabend create I caught this in a wonderful article of yours comparing Bartley, Popper, and Feyerabend. And of course, I will link all these articles below for listeners. And you write in there that at least early on, Feyerabend begins to flirt with the idea of creating a theory of meaning. So again, everyone's critical of Wittgenstein, but he seems to come close to the idea of Wittgenstein's where language comes from its use.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. So one of the things that I'm increasingly coming to believe is that Feyerabend was kind of a radical kind of Wittgensteinian. And Wittgenstein was a much more palpable influence on Feyerabend than is usually suspected. So Feyerabend has a paper in 1955, which was supposed to be a book review of the philosophical investigations, but it turned into just a very long paper. And Feyerabend's conclusion is basically, Wittgenstein's right, you can't come up with the meaning of a word through the establishment of a rule. And Feyerabend takes this to lead to a very radical conclusion that you can't dictate meaning through some theory of meaning that is independent of the practice in which certain words or certain phrases get their the ones in which they're practiced. So what Feyerabend takes from Wittgenstein is a practice first approach to philosophy, and questions about meaning, but also just broader questions about rationality, and questions about truth, knowledge. All of these kinds of questions kind of dissolve or become uninteresting in their conventional philosophical formulations. There's only kind of what makes sense to do in light of a practice that you're already involved with or commenting on or something like that. So what he disagrees with Wittgenstein is, so Wittgenstein thinks that this leads to a quietist conclusion that we should give up on philosophy altogether. And Feyerabend thinks, well, philosophy is just another kind of practice out there. So there's nothing special about philosophy that it kind of needs to get abandoned. It's just another practice. And we can look at the practice of philosophy through the lenses of various the internal kind of norms of the practice, but you can also look at it from other perspectives, from other kinds of practices, and you can think, well, is this practice a good one? Is it one that we want to continue, promote, be a part of, experiment with, or is it something that we should leave behind? There's no a priori answer to that. So I think Feyerabend took this to a very radical extreme, which is you can't really sensibly do, and this is the anti-foundationalism, you can't really sensibly do philosophy or anything unless you already kind of have a practice in mind. And then you have to be aware of the practice in which you're participating, right? So Feyerabend's choice of using lots of rhetoric and against method is him being aware that he's not just, some person pontificating truths or attempted truths out there, right? He's a part of a practice. He's an academic professor. He gets a certain salary. He's writing a book that has a certain publisher and has certain people reading it, and they have various reactions to it, right? So he's thinking about his own practice, or his own writings and his own ideas as already enmeshed in a certain kind of practice. So a lot of his criticisms of philosophy as a whole are really directed at the practice of philosophy as he understood it, which is detached from other practices which give clear and obvious benefits, right? Feyerabend maybe wavered on the benefits of the sciences, but other kinds of disciplines like the arts that clearly enrich our culture and our lives, philosophy is just so detached from these things as an academic practice. And as a result, the practice doesn't give us very much. It kind of gives us intellectual games that some people like playing and hefty salaries and not much more. So I think you're right to suggest that, for Feyerabend's views on semantics and of meaning were deeply influenced by Wittgenstein, but I think that much more comes out of that as well. Feyerabend takes it to fairly radical conclusions, I think, and this leads to a total re-envisioning of what philosophy is and what it's supposed to be doing.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. There's a stretch in here, or a certain reach that this principle of this pluralism or this anything goes has. And for Feyerabend, and this, I found this really quite extraordinary. There's one part I completely didn't understand, and one part I thought was quite, a very interesting philosophical fiat of a kind, where he solves, for himself at least, he solves the problem of the empirical basis with that pluralism, where he goes on to say that it really isn't a problem at all. It's a pseudo problem. You can simply use whatever particular method of science, whatever understanding you have for whichever purpose that comes your way. But he goes on then later on, and please correct me if I'm wrong in any of this, to talk about resistance and the idea that our theories bump into resistance out there in the world when they bump into each other. And importantly for him, he says, this is not the same as a falsification or a contradiction, which Bartley or Popper might have thought it would be.
Right. So I think that's all right. Feyerabend's, I think, earliest hint at this kind of argument is in his work on the mind-body problem. Right. So one thing that you can find over and over in his corpus is he takes what seem to be philosophical problems, right? Mind-body problem, problem of induction, problem of the empirical basis, so on. And then he thinks like, okay, well, why do we take this to be a genuine problem? Right? Well, it only seems to be a problem if you have certain kind of practices that are in play and informing the norms by which you establish what counts as a problem, what counts as a good solution to the problem, and so on. So there's already this kind of practice-based thought going on there. So Feyerabend's pluralism is just kind of like, well, look, like there's nothing intrinsic about practices that make them good or bad. They only seem good or bad from the perspective of various practices. So what pluralism allows you to do is to just say, look, I'm just going to engage in a practice. It presumes a solution to a philosophical problem, and then we'll see how the practice works. And that's kind of not satisfying for a lot of philosophers, but I think that's the way that Feyerabend's looking at this. He's dissolving the traditional issues that philosophers concern themselves with and asking much more mundane kind of questions like, okay, so like, let's look at sailors who had certain views about the experience of sailors who came before them, right? And they had certain rules about how they did that. Instead of asking whether these are justified or anything, let's just look at what they did, and then think, okay, is there something we can learn from this practice? And the answer is almost always yes, in Feyerabend's view. So I think things like the problem of the empirical basis for Feyerabend are just not particularly that important to solve. What's more important is to establish a practice and to see what kind of features it has. So I think that part is absolutely right. And then there's the other point about resistance. And this is something that I think is really tricky. And unfortunately, Feyerabend died while he was still kind of working on fleshing this idea out. But the way that I think about it is resistance is something that happens when you have a human being engaging with their environment, and they might not be doing any kind of speaking or describing of what they're doing at all, right? So you try to walk through a door and you just don't, right? You had a very clear sense in your mind about what it was going to mean for you to walk through that door. And then it just doesn't happen the way you want it to, right? That kind of concrete resistance doesn't necessarily need to be something expressed in propositional form, right? So one thing about Feyerabend is that, when we talk about language and ways of describing things, we immediately get into this kind of pluralist kind of game, because there's lots of different ways you can describe your experience and the things that happen to you and so on and so forth. And it's very, very hard to make sense of the notion of a test in those kinds of cases. But there's a very straightforward kind of way in which it makes sense in practice, which is not has nothing to do with coming up with a scientific theory. It's just you walk into the door and it bumps into you and you didn't get what you wanted out of it. And again, resistance is something that not everybody encounters, and not everybody encounters equally, right? So people who work in the laboratory or who are working kind of with their hands and building things, they encounter this resistance every day in their practice. But when you're in the realm of pure theory, the kind of resistance you get is a little bit different. The resistance you get is kind of, oh, you kind of didn't follow the norms, you didn't follow the norms of your profession well. There's kind of like a social resistance there. It's not quite the same. So I think resistance is something that only comes up it comes up in everybody's lives, but it comes up in different ways, depending on to what extent you're kind of engaged with the world around us in this kind of direct sort of way. And that's something that you're not compelled to take seriously in order to be rational. But a lot of the reasons you have to take it seriously is because you have certain practices that you want to see fulfilled, right? So if we want to create medicines that allow people to live longer, happier lives, right? That view is going to get frustrated. You're going to have certain practices that you want to set up to try to make that happen, and those might get frustrated. And insofar as it's a part of your practical goal to kind of work with the world in a certain kind of way, that resistance is something you need to take seriously. But again, that kind of norm that resistance gives is relative to a practice, right? So I don't know enough about this to speak with confidence, but let's at least take the stereotype of a person who believes all kinds of things, and the world keeps resisting their beliefs. But instead of changing their beliefs, they say, there's something else going on that's making the world act this way. My beliefs aren't the problem. It has to do something with the interaction. And you can keep doing this all you want. There's nothing irrational about that. But it might not lead to a particularly fruitful practice, or a practice that many other people would want to mimic. So I think resistance is not the same thing as the Popperian notion of a test, which is a proposition that has a truth value. It's about establishing a practice that has certain features. And most of the practices that are very attractive to us are ones that have encountered resistance and found various ways to deal with it. And there's nothing more to it than that. So I think it doesn't become something like a philosophical principle at the end of the day. It more just becomes, kind of our ordinary ways of thinking about, the person who keeps walking into the wall, trying to get to the other side without, trying to walk right through it or something like that. Like, that just seems dumb. Like, unless you can give me a reason to do that, like maybe it's a lot of fun. There's no real obvious reason to do it. And so the answer to these kind of deep philosophical problems becomes kind of just ordinary, mundane, about the kinds of practices we want to engage in.
He opens the door, it seems, at times for, again, this is going to be a part of rationalism that he quite clearly rails against, but a significant part of a lot of the philosophy of science is an injunction against ad hoc theories. And Feyerabend seems to say at times that it's actually okay. And he points to, I believe this is back to Galileo again, he uses as the example here, where he goes on to say that there is, in fact, a place and a time for ad hoc theories.
Yeah. Yes, that's absolutely right. So Feyerabend, his reconstruction of Galileo is based on the idea that sometimes you got to take a step forward or a step backwards to take two steps forward, right? So if you were to look at his initial speculations about, the motion of the Earth, right? If you use established theories at the time, it looks stupid, and then you would dismiss it and you would get rid of it. But if you kind of say, no, maybe our background theories are what's wrong, and we change it, and you start realizing that changing those background theories is very complicated, and it takes years, decades, centuries even of hard work in order to figure out what changes are even necessary. In those kinds of cases, you have to be ad hoc, and you have to be ad hoc for a long time until you kind of get this new theory that you now know kind of what it says, and you have a clear sense about whether it's good or not. So yeah, I think this is another part of where the break from Popper is very straightforward. Feyerabend doesn't really say much about ad hocness in his earlier papers, but by Against Method, he finds a clear role for ad hoc hypothesis in the development of early theories.
There is just to explain to people how far Feyerabend goes with some of this. At one point, I read him defending creationism at one point, and this is what seems to have got Agassi so upset, is he's defending voodoo at one point. And again, and this, I'm not sure, but this sounded very much, I'm assuming there's some similarities here between Feyerabend and Larry Loudon in some sense, where my best understanding, again, please correct me if I'm missing a lot here or just a little, but it's that he's saying that it's not so much that these ideas are particularly fruitful, but it's that we should let that side of the argument, develop as much evidence and as much argument and give us the best presentation that they possibly can without shutting them down too early.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think, Feyerabend's defenses of things like voodoo and creationism, I think, are a little bit more rhetorical than genuine on his part. I think you genuinely believe that creationism should be taught as a scientific theory for the reasons of pluralism. You should have these two ideas compete with one another and see, understand what the virtues of them relative to one another. So he certainly defends the teaching of it. When he defends voodoo, he kind of just makes a couple quick remarks, and he says things like, there are things like voodoo death, and everyone knows that voodoo death exists. But we just don't know how to explain it in a materialistic kind of way. And those kinds of very vague remarks are, I think, far from like a defense of it. Same with astrology, I think. But there are certain views that Feyerabend had close to his heart that were considered to be ridiculous, obviously false, anti-scientific, that he thought were right. And most of them had to do with medicine. Feyerabend had war injuries and was struggling with his health his whole life. And the modern medicine that was available to him, and I think even to this day, just about everyone can relate to this, modern medicine a lot of times did not provide great solutions to the problems that he had. And those and sometimes they introduce new problems, and their diagnostics would often say that he was fine when he felt horrible. And so, he felt no undying loyalty, I think is his phrase, to specific forms of medicine. So he started playing around with other ideas, including a faith healer and acupuncturist, as well as a special type of masseuse trained in traditional Chinese medicine. Now we don't, or at least I don't know the details of, what exactly, he was doing. But the things he mentions in his text is, look, I did these things. They worked for me. A lot of people around me have done them and they work for me. Like, it's only rumors and gossip that make people think that these alternative medicines are just a bunch of hogwash. So there were certain things that I think Feyerabend really believed in that would have raised eyebrows to a lot of his colleagues. But the reasons that he was attracted to these views are reasons that any philosopher of science on their own terms should appreciate, right? They were evidence-based. They were based on certain practices that seemed to work, at least within a certain kind of scope. So,
yeah, please. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, Feyerabend's discussion of the pseudosciences or the purported pseudosciences, like you have to kind of take them one at a time, in terms of what kind of things did he really believe and what kinds of things was he kind of putting out there just to provoke. But the bigger idea, which is if we're going to evaluate things like voodoo, and this should not be a controversial point, we should know something about voodoo. We should actually know how it works, or how it doesn't work, or what its theory is. And if it doesn't work, you are perfectly permitted to try to go and make it work. That's a part of what scientific inquiry is. You are permitted to try to expand that research program. You might not, and that's okay too. So the idea that I think his defenses of pseudosciences should be much less controversial than they were. There were certain ones he was willing to kind of put his stamp of approval on, and those were based on concrete successes.
Let's talk about one of those concrete successes.
Yeah, sure.
Because you have written an article here, and this is one of the famous ones that, again, enraged so many people about Feyerabend. It's the case of traditional Chinese medicine in the early days of communist China. So instead of me introducing, I'll just open the floor up to you on this one, because it's a fascinating thing. And for many people, it seemed to be a contradiction of kind for Feyerabend. But I'll open that up with this idea of freedom in science and what the Communist Party did in the early stages.
Yeah. So traditional Chinese medicine was something very close to Feyerabend's heart and to his own practice. But one thing that he found when he was looking at its history, which was recently becoming kind of documented quite carefully in the late 1960s, was this phenomenon that he saw all around him, which he called scientific chauvinism. Right. And scientific chauvinism is not a good argument, but it's still a very common pattern of reasoning, which is here's a certain idea, tradition, whatever. It's inconsistent with science, whatever that means. And because it's inconsistent with science, then that practice needs to go. Right. So this is another way of thinking about, in the same way that we should reject theories of scientific method as these kinds of eternally grounded things. The idea of science as a set of practices, as a set of institutions, is not beyond criticism. It's just because something is inconsistent with it doesn't mean that that thing needs to go. Maybe it's the science that needs to be reformed. But what happened in early 20th century China was you get a pile of political revolutionaries who are Marxists, and they were committed materialists. And they thought that traditional Chinese medicine wasn't sufficiently materialistic. So they wanted to mimic some of the amazing medical discoveries that were coming out of the West. And so they just demolished institutionally, culturally, but not through actual arguments. They just demolished a whole series of practices, acupuncture, moxibustion, a wide variety of practices, medical treatments, diagnostic techniques, that all kind of fall under this rubric of traditional Chinese medicine. They just became totally eliminated. So the way that they came back was Chairman Mao, in a quite dictatorial way. He forced hospitals and universities to start teaching and researching on traditional Chinese medicine again. People didn't like that because that generation of scientists had been raised on this materialist kind of view that they feel they got from the West. And they didn't want the revival of traditional Chinese medicine. It was very much forced upon them. But what ended up happening after you have now this incursion of Western medicine, Western materialist medicine, and traditional Chinese medicine co-inhabiting the same kind of intellectual institutional spaces, what happens? Well, the things that always seem to happen with pluralism. The ideas benefited from one another. So you get all sorts of really interesting incredible developments that come. I think it took a couple decades to get started. Maybe in the late 1970s or early 80s. I'm not entirely sure on that, but after a certain amount of time, pluralism, kind of showed its fruits, right? It turned out that Western medicine had a lot of things that it couldn't explain very well, and these were anomalies that were brought forth by traditional Chinese medicine research programs, and it kind of went a little bit in the other way too. So pluralism enriched our understanding of medicine, right? So what Feyerabend sees as interesting in this case, beyond the value that traditional Chinese medicine had shown in that history and in his own experiences, the thing that he really seemed to find interesting is about the freedom of scientists to kind of follow their curiosity, right? So there's this idea, and it's still around today, which is this: we should take a laissez-faire approach to science. Scientific experts know best, right? Let's just let them do their thing, and they'll give us all these great discoveries, if we just leave them alone to kind of do their things. Now, of course, that's a bit of an oversimplification of a more complicated worldview, but that's the basic idea. And what Feyerabend takes his case study and mean is that, look, sometimes scientists suck, right? They don't know what's actually best about their own practice, right? So in this case, you had a bunch of dogmatic materialists who didn't even really understand the alternatives that they had come to reject. And by being forced to engage with them, they no longer could kind of rely on this unquestioned authority. They actually had to engage with the practice itself. And this is kind of a Popperian thing, right? There's more critical discussion in the air. And if we left scientists alone, I guess we never know exactly what would happen, but most likely, at least for a long time, the scientists would have just dogmatically kind of stayed in their rut, right? And this is something that happens, right? So in a chapter of Science in a Free Society called The Strange Case of Astrology, he takes this letter that was a manifesto. It was signed by 180 scientists, Nobel Prize winners, and so on, all of them saying astrology is a pile of garbage and should be dismissed. And none of them knew anything about astrology. And the point is, it shouldn't be that complicated. The point is, you're probably actually going to make better scientists if you force them to actually understand views that contradict their own and that are fairly far out there. Ideas that really make you question the basis of what it is that you're doing, right? So in the traditional Chinese medicine case, there's some really fundamental questions. Are diseases spatiotemporal entities? Or are they emergent properties of individual bodies, right? Should you be relying on replicable experimental results? Or should you be focused on building from traditions with many, many, many case studies of individual humans, right? Like, these are really fundamental methodological questions that get raised when you're forced to engage with these traditions that are very different from your own. And scientists aren't always going to do that on their own. And so sometimes you need outside pressure, something to force them to say, look, you can't get away with this kind of dismissive attitude anymore. You kind of actually have to start engaging with this stuff more seriously. Now, of course, the way Mao did that was in a very dictatorial, undemocratic way. The way Feyerabend would like to see that done is in a way that is made respectable by democratic kind of panels. But the idea is the same. Scientists shouldn't be free to just do whatever they want. And we shouldn't just leave them alone in order to trust them. Sometimes we have to force them against their own will to adjust their practice. And in that way, Feyerabend is going right back to the early aspirations of philosophy of science, right? Which is something that can say, at least sometimes, hey, scientists, you're not doing things right and things need to change, right? And I think that was a goal of people like Popper. And that certainly was always a goal of Feyerabend's as well.
I'm assuming it would have infuriated his friend Thomas Kuhn as well, I'm guessing. This seems to be the question of the day for so many people, this idea of democratic supervision of, I mean, ideally not in the Chinese in the Chinese example, but ideally a democratic supervision of science. Is Feyerabend saying that there is no internal external distinction to science? There's nothing special about it in that sense, or is he saying that the layman, me and everyone else out there, can simply go into science and supervise it? Because at some point, at least this is how the common argument runs, this is a challenging thing to do, to supervise a process that is incredibly specialized and hard to understand.
Yeah. So this is also, by the way, something that Kuhn really struggled with as well. So I think Feyerabend's writings on their own, I don't think give us a clear direction, but through a number of case studies, which was kind of his method of choice, he tries to motivate a kind of optimism about the epistemic capabilities of lay people, and he tries to denigrate the supposed expertise of scientists, right? So one of his papers, he argues that expertise is, at least sometimes, a kind of inflated idea, where scientists use tons of jargon to make their kind of papers impenetrable, but that jargon wasn't necessary for them to actually write a clear paper. So, I mean, Feyerabend's points are they're very case study, they're very kind of specific, right? So he's not giving a totally general principled argument that says lay people know plenty to kind of be involved with decision making at higher levels of regulating scientific institutions. I think he's not. I think if you go through all his writings, you're never going to find a convincing general argument of that form. What he does do, I think, is show that it is possible, and not just logically possible, like we could dream it, but as in it's something that, with a bit of effort, we could really do. And I think since Feyerabend has died, this has become more and more obviously the case, right? Citizens have, lay people have shown time and time again that with enough commitment, which is key and that isn't always available, with enough commitment, citizens can learn enough about the science to be welcome participants in the process. And Feyerabend thinks this is important for reasons of pluralism, right? Citizens often bring perspectives that scientists don't have or might not regularly have, right? So they're bringing something special to the table. Now, in order to allow them to make those arguments effectively, there's a lot that needs to be done. One of the big issues with democratizing science these days is, there's individual cases where you have people like activists or lawyers it's their job to kind of figure out the situation. But in a lot of cases, you kind of only get to take people out of their everyday lives for kind of, 2 days. And there's not much you can do to get them up to speed with something very technical and something that's very much at the cutting edge. So there are these challenges that come from having lay people involved with science in a way that's actually constructive, in a way that actually allows for this kind of critical pluralism to flourish. It's a difficult thing, but it's one that we've shown that we can do. And ultimately, I think what you get in Feyerabend is a case for optimism on those grounds.
There's a phrase that Feyerabend likes to use, and he calls people cranks, which I guess is an old-fashioned kind of phrase. And but again, people might hear Feyerabend using that phrase and think this seems to go counter to his philosophy. But I think this is an important distinction that we haven't quite touched on enough. And I might quote Feyerabend here. He says, "The distinction between the crank and the respectable thinker lies in the research that is done once a certain point of view is adopted." So he seems to be open. So this might open the question to what type of pluralism we're talking about as well. He seems to be open to the idea of letting as many ideas and methods and everything else flow. But there is a distinction to draw based on how someone treats their ideas after they have adopted it.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really key and crucial distinction, right? So, some people get worried when they hear about Feyerabend's ideas that you're just going to get the dumbest people involved with science, and they're just going to muck it up, right? And in Feyerabend's case, you have to kind of look at the examples that he uses, right? And the examples that he uses are people who I think everybody with a kind of sober mind will recognize as just decently intelligent people. That doesn't necessarily mean that they come to the conclusions that scientists want them to. But the idea is there are some people who like to bash science and they don't know anything about the science. They don't want to learn anything about the science. And they're maybe just bashing it, I don't know, just to get more, followers on Twitter or whatever, right? There are people who are out there who are like that, and they gum up the works, and they gum up the works in science and any other kind of intellectual discourse. But what Feyerabend, I think, really tries to push, and I think he's completely right in this, is that just because somebody isn't a scientist or recognized as a scientist, doesn't, and just because their views might seem absolutely crazy and out there, it doesn't mean that they're a crank. It doesn't mean that they're just kind of saying things and not really thinking about them. It just means that they're unorthodox. And so I think Feyerabend does, in some passages, try to draw this line where he says, like, look, when we're talking about including people in increasing the number of participants in this pluralistic game of making science the best it can be, and also keeping science in check against other kinds of institutions, other kinds of values that we might have. There's a certain type of person that does that very well. And those virtues are the kinds of things that we ought to be looking for. And those virtues don't, a lot of people like to just think of scientists as these impartial observers on the search for objective truth. Some scientists are quite ingenious and clever and very thoughtful and careful with what they do, and others are not so much like that. And then you get people on the outside who, some of them are dogmatic and just want to yell at the top of their lungs, and then you have other people who have really done their homework and they have thoughtful criticisms that deserve airspace. So the distinction between cranks and respectable thinkers is not the distinction between experts and non-experts, or experts and lay people. And I think that is a really important point to bring up, because not only does it suggest that we reorient our discussion of what kinds of people should we be looking for, of who's getting seats at the table, so to speak. Not just that, but also kind of realizing that anything goes is in the hands of some pretty talented people, right? So there's this old saying, to break the rules first, you have to know the rules, right? So if you think about things in those terms, you might be a lot more comfortable with the kind of anything goes, very open-ended kind of account of scientific inquiry, when you know that it's in the hands of people who are serious, careful, intelligent people.
I know from reading through some of your articles here that you have tried to build on Feyerabend. I was going to list out a series of criticisms, and I wrote a few down in front of me here. And as I was reading them just then, as you were finishing your answer, I realized we probably answered most of them pretty much. So I might ask you: do you see personally anywhere where Feyerabend may have gone wrong, and if not, or if so, how has your own research built upon Feyerabend, and how do you like to see Feyerabend's legacy being built upon into the future?
So most of my research has focused on science funding policy, my more recent research. And I came to that because I thought the arguments for this kind of open-ended pluralism might be pretty convincing on a certain level, but then the question always comes, but we only have limited resources, right? So this idea that we're limited, and maybe it would be nice if we explored every idea totally openly. Maybe that would be nice, but because of limited resources, we shouldn't do that. And so Feyerabend needs to be just kind of brushed to the side. And I take the problem of limited resources very seriously in a way that I don't think Feyerabend did. And so my one research question that's really guided me over the past few years is, what happens to a kind of Feyerabendian pluralism that sounds nice very abstractly, but then you put it in a concrete context where there's only so much stuff we can do? How does Feyerabend's view have to adjust? Because I don't think, or I think that I don't think that just science funding agencies should just support absolutely anything that comes across his desk. I think that would be rightfully perceived as crazy. But then, but I also don't think that this means that we should just give up on Feyerabend's arguments for pluralism entirely. That is, we don't need to fall back on this idea that, oh, well, there's some view of scientific method, in this case, some view of scientific inquiry, scientific pursuit, that we know that it's not, infallible, but it's, good enough to kind of constrain our research programs and constrain pluralism in kind of a conservative sort of way. So I think that this is a kind of challenging situation that Feyerabend himself never really took seriously. And it's one that I intend to, and have tried to in some of my more recent writings. So the basic, this is maybe a bit of an oversimplification of a kind of a work in progress. But my thought is that Feyerabendian kind of anarchism, this open-ended pluralism, ought to only be practiced in very specific circumstances. And they're circumstances that what I'm now calling luxury science, which is scientific research where you don't care when you get certain results back. And this is different from urgent contexts. In urgent contexts, you have some pressing demand that says we need to have certain kinds of scientific knowledge as soon as possible, or, within the next few years or whatever. And this, and my view is that you get kind of a tale of two Feyerabends that aren't the same, that kind of operate in these distinctive kind of places. So you don't get anything goes in urgent science. When the COVID pandemic hit, and a vaccine became highly demanded. Of course, there's billions of dollars invested in this. So a certain amount of experimenting with kind of slightly more out there ideas is acceptable. But for the most part, most of the money went into building on research that we already have a decent amount of confidence in, and research that we hope will get us a vaccine really, really soon, because we need it immediately, right? So in that context, I think it would be quite irrational to suggest we need a vaccine, we need it as soon as possible. So let's just kind of take out of a hat any idea that somebody comes across, no matter how crazy it seems. Because if you do that, whatever ideas you get, maybe they're going to turn out to be successful, but you're definitely not going to get success in the short term. There's going to be way too much work that needs to be done to bring that kind of research program into fighting shape. So I think it's in these urgent contexts that we need to be much more constrained in the kinds of science that we practice. I do think that should be democratically guided. So I think that's, a very Feyerabendian kind of theme, but you don't get anything goes. You very much get a little bit more conservatism kind of in there. But then when you look at the kind of case studies that Feyerabend's looking at, like Galileo and scientific revolution, that's hundreds and hundreds of years. I really think that we have no idea what's going to pan out if we're looking at things from, what's going to turn out to have been really groundbreaking from the perspective of science in 500 years from now. We have no idea. And a lot of my arguments are trying to show there's principled reasons why we have no idea how this is going to turn out. And this kind of openness that Feyerabend preaches is a really, really great thing. But we shouldn't kid ourselves and think that some of those research programs are going to show us anything useful in the short term. If they have anything to contribute, it's going to be kind of like Galileo's, right? It took hundreds of years until it turned out to become a really important discovery and not just a ridiculous idea that some guy had once. So I think that science funding policy is kind of where questions about pluralism kind of become really interesting, because you can't rely on these old kind of views about science and scientific inquiry, but you can't go full Feyerabend either. And figuring out how it works, where that sweet spot is, I take to be a really fun topic to kind of research on. And so that's where I think you have to modify certain Feyerabendian ideas in order to kind of make it workable.
It's also a great note to leave the podcast on with not just your comments, but I'm going to put links below to where people can go and read Jamie's work and all his other work on Feyerabend as well. There's so much more we could have got to in the podcast, and I did plan on getting to. So perhaps we'll have to chat again at some point in the future. Jamie, It's just such a pleasure. And again, like I said, I'm going to link everything below, and I can't encourage the listeners enough to go and read your work. Jamie Shaw, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for your kind words.